Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is from Mr. President to Mr. Citizen. The year is 1951. The Korean War is continuing. The peace talks are finally underway, but they would languish for the next couple of years. The fighting would continue, mostly a stalemate in and around the 38th parallel. This is something that was never off the mind of Harry Truman. Those peace talks just took a long time to finally unfold and would not be settled until after Truman left office. Military-wise in Europe, NATO was now getting up and running, and Truman asked Dwight Eisenhower to come out of retirement and actually go set up the military operation in Europe. He agreed to do so, so that was up and running. It was a difficult year for Harry Truman. Again, the war in Korea was very unpopular, and that certainly was hurting his favorability ratings, and there were also charges of corruption really coming to the fore here in 1951, beginning with the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Now, the Bureau of Internal Revenue was staffed with a lot of political appointees coming from the Democratic National Committee, and particularly in the regional offices. There were charges of sort of political favoritism in the nation's administration of the tax code, and there were problems such that Truman actually had to investigate, and he removed 113 people who were sort of mixed up in this in some way, and then he put in some pretty significant structural changes, trying to depoliticize the Bureau and to bring in more civil servant positions that had civil service protections and more career people, also more authority for the commissioner centered in Washington, D.C., trying to clean that up. He was also actually, his administration was charged of corruption in terms of influence peddling. And Truman had a number of his close friends and confidants sort of in and around him, including some on his staff, like Harry Vaughn, the general who was his military aide, been with him for a long time, the days in the Senate, known since World War I rather. And Truman liked having him around. He's sort of fun-loving, gregarious. He was also a bit of a bull in a china shop. And there were accusations that he was, again, doing some form of influence peddling. And he was going to be called in front of Congress. He offered to resign, and Truman said, no, I want you around. Keep doing what you're doing. He was trying to have a standoff here on this. But these charges were sort of hitting all at the same time. Truman's conclusion after his administration was, I don't think there were a greater number of scandals in the administration in which I was the head than there had been in previous administrations, and there had been in the administration which followed me, speaking about the Eisenhower administration many years later. But the problem for Truman, again, it was happening all at the same time. The Korean War, unpopular time for Harry Truman as president. He was energized a bit by a visit from Winston Churchill. 77 years old, he's the prime minister in Britain once again. He came and had a wonderful visit, good for personal relations, international relations between the two countries. Churchill told something interesting to Truman, very, very frankly. The last time you and I sat across the conference table was at Potsdam, Mr. President. I must confess, sir, I held you in very low regard then. I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt. I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you more than any other man have saved Western civilization. From Winston Churchill to Harry Truman, talking about the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War management, trying to check the Soviets' no appeasement. High praise from Winston Churchill. The Trumans finally moved back into the White House. After 3 years of the renovation, March the 27th, they were finally able to move back in, and this thing turned out to be a phenomenal success. Truman was proud to say that Bess and I looked over the East Room, Green Room, Blue Room, Red Room, State Dining Room. They are lovely. So was the hall, the State Stairway. I spent the evening going over the house with all the trouble and worry. It is worth it. And it was very popular. This one moment in time, very popular for Truman. He went on network TV, gave a tour, 30 million people tuned in. At least for a moment, he had a little popularity amongst a very difficult year. The economy in these last couple of years of the Truman administration actually doing reasonably well. Unemployment remained under 3%, but labor issues were popping up just like they had at the beginning of his first term. This time, it was the steel industry. There was a conflict about wages. The steel workers wanted more. Management wanted to give less. The Truman administration got involved, tried to arbitrate for months, but the steel workers basically said, this isn't working, we're going to go on strike. April the 8th of 1952, Truman said, look, that can't happen. We're in the middle of a war. I'm going to stop this because I'm going to seize the steel mills, operate them by the government. And that's what he did. The Commerce Department all of a sudden was in charge of 88 steel mills across the country. The workers showed up, they did their work, they got the same pay, but management went to court immediately. Said, look, the president has overstepped his authority. He can't seize the steel mills. There's no constitutional authority for that. A lower court gave him an injunction, went to the Supreme Court, where Truman was confident. He had his own appointees on the court. He thought he would win, and he did not. 6-3 was the decision against the administration. Hugo Black read the decision. We cannot, with faithfulness to our constitutional system, hold that the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces has the ultimate power as such to take possession of private property in order to keep labor disputes from stopping production. This is a job for the nation's lawmakers, not for its military authorities. Immediately, the workers went on strike, and they were out for about 53 days. Fortunately for the defense business, they had enough inventory to kind of keep going during those couple of months. It did not really have a negative effect on the defense industry, but it was kind of a black eye for Truman overreaching his authority, another one of his challenges here in his last couple of years. Well, it is an election year of 1952. The 22nd Amendment had been passed. Only 2 terms now for a president. No more 4-term presidents like Franklin Roosevelt. Truman thought this was undemocratic. In fact, he called the 22nd Amendment a monstrosity, but it had an exemption for the incumbent. If Harry Truman wanted to run one more time, he could. He decided not to. He announced on March the 29th that I've served my country long, and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel it's my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House. So now it's a wide open field. Republicans, Democrats, who are going to get the nominations? Well, Dwight Eisenhower came out finally and said, I'm a Republican, and they were happy to have the very popular general as their Republican nominee for the presidency in 1952. For the Democrats, a whole bunch of names were considered. Truman was getting involved in trying to recruit the best person he could think of. Eventually, he set his sights on Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. They met twice at the White House over a couple of months, and Stevenson kept balking. He said, I'm not sure if this is right for me, not the right time. I'm going to rerun for office, maybe in Illinois. But as the convention was about to be held in July, Stevenson came back to Truman and said, look, if you'll support me, I'll make the run. And Truman said, sure, that's what I've been trying to do here for the last several months. Stevenson got the nomination. Truman was all set to go work for him, and Stevenson immediately distanced himself from the president, Harry Truman. Fact was, Truman wasn't that popular, and so Stevenson thought he might be a drag on the ticket as opposed to a help. Stevenson tried to do it by himself. Truman was irked about this. At the end, Stevenson did reach out, and Truman did do some campaigning because he wanted to do anything to keep not only the Democrats in power, but also to prevent Dwight Eisenhower from reaching the White House. He was really annoyed with Eisenhower over an incident on the campaign trail that occurred in the state of Wisconsin. This is Joe McCarthy territory, the man who had been sort of communist baiting about communists embedded in government all over the place, particularly the State Department. He had been attacking Dean Acheson, George Marshall for months, and Truman, of course, had been outspokenly annoyed about this. Well, Eisenhower is going to campaign in Wisconsin, and he had planned in his speech to actually praise George Marshall, the man who had actually had such a big thing to do with his career. He was going to make a statement. Well, McCarthy heard about this, and he recommended that Eisenhower take that part out of his speech. And Eisenhower agreed to do that, and Truman was simply beside himself. Truman said when Eisenhower let McCarthy get away with calling General Marshall a traitor, why, that was one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. The trouble with Eisenhower is he's just a coward. He hasn't got any backbone at all. He ought to be ashamed for what he did, but I don't think there's any shame in him. But the country wasn't worried about this. They liked Ike. They put him over the top easily in the Electoral College, beating Stevenson 442-89. The Republicans were coming back to the White House for the first time in a long time. Truman did try to sort of be the right guy and have a smooth transition. He invited Ike to come to the White House, get a briefing from the cabinet. It was a pretty frosty event. Eisenhower seemed annoyed during the whole time, didn't go over very well. Heading to the final end here, Truman gave his final speech to the nation as president January the 15th of 1953. In this, he said, when Franklin Roosevelt died, I felt there must be 1 million men better qualified than I to take up the presidential task, but the work was mine to do, and I had to do it. I've tried to give it everything that was in me. Good night, and God bless you all. The inauguration day still frosty between Truman and Eisenhower, not a comfortable ride together from the White House to the Capitol Hill for the transfer of power. Truman did get a nice reception at Union Station. About 10,000 people showed up at the train station to sing Auld Lang Syne and wish him well. He showed up back in Independence, Missouri now as Mr. Citizen, Citizen Truman. Another 10,000 people were at that train station, a few thousand more at the house on Delaware Street as he and Bess were ready to move back into Independence and get on with their lives. 20 years Truman would live in retirement. Now, one of the things he needed was some money. He did save some of his $100,000 a year salary from his presidential days, but of course he had never had much money. He had a lot of offers. He could have done quite well for himself, and he turned down almost everything. He said, oh yes, I could have been a millionaire and then some, I guess. But they weren't interested in hiring me. They were hiring an ex-president. They wanted to cash in on that, and they offered me a lot of six-figure salaries to do nothing much at all except let them use the name of an ex-president. I would not let them do it, though. I'd rather die in the poorhouse than do a thing like that. Biggest way for him to make money was to write his memoirs, and he was given an offer of $670,000 to write those memoirs. He agreed to do it. It took several years. It was laborious work. He worked through multiple editors and assistants. First, it was not enough writing, then it was too much writing. Kind of criticized for being maybe too impersonal in the memoirs, too much history and not enough sort of personal insights and perspective. He was pretty pleased with the final outcome, which came out in 2 volumes. The first was focused on his first year as president. He called it Year of Decisions. The second volume was Years of Trial and Hope for the rest of his presidency. But really the better memoir from Truman was the oral biography he gave to Merle Miller a little bit later on. It was one of the better presidential memoirs since Ulysses Grant had written his. Very candid insights, very revealing, but none of this was lucrative for Truman. 2/3 went to taxes. Payments to his assistants on his memoirs, from that $670,000, he walked away with only about $37,000. So still needed to find ways to make money. Eventually, he became settled financially when he sold his interest in the family farm in Grandview. He and his siblings decided to sell that. It eventually became a shopping center. That brought him enough money that he didn't really have to worry much about money going forward. Now, March of 1953, Joseph Stalin, the premier in the Soviet Union, died. So now you've got new leaders in Moscow and in Washington. This was maybe the final step to finally get to that armistice in July of 1953 in Korea. The final tally from a casualty count for the Americans, 58,000 Americans were killed. About 3 million Koreans were killed, about 2/3 of which were civilians. That's in both North and South. But in the big picture to Truman, this was a successful mission. The Soviets were checked at the 38th parallel. They were not able to take over South Korea. There were no domino effects, and World War III was avoided. Truman was able to do this by containing it within the borders of Korea. It was messy, it was not popular, but there was no appeasement, and it did not turn into World War III, so in the end, it was a success in Truman's mind. The main project of Hoover's retirement years was his presidential library. Franklin Roosevelt was the first to establish a library, a place where people could go and study the president's papers and research topics related to decisions that were made. This became his greatest joy. His intent of the library was that to be a place where young people can come and learn what the office of the president is, what a great office it is, no matter who happens to be in it at that time. He raised funds, he designed the library, all aspects of it he was involved in. It opened in 1957. Herbert Hoover was there. Chief Justice Earl Warren came. Eleanor Roosevelt, Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, kind of a who's who. Dwight Eisenhower, the president, did not show up for the unveiling of the library. This was a research museum on the one hand. There were about 3.5 million items that were put in there for researchers to go through. The place was just about a mile from Truman's home. He could get there in a couple of minutes in his car, and he was there about 7 days a week. He was the main attraction of the Truman Library. He would give tours, he gave lectures, he did Q&A sessions, especially again with young people, high school people. Every once in a while, he played the piano, he would tell stories. No one was there to tell him what to say. He spoke his mind. He loved every minute of this thing. Truman said that nothing that has happened to me during or since the presidency has given me such deep and abiding satisfaction. It was a great way to spend his retirement years, not really in retirement because he was busy working every single day at the Truman Library. They had about 150,000 people that came in that first year. Dignitaries would come as well, international, national, political folks. 1960, John F. Kennedy came during the 1960 presidential election to visit. 1961, Dwight Eisenhower actually came, but it was really just sort of a technical exercise. He wanted to learn about how to set up one of these libraries. You had Lyndon Johnson came during his presidency a few times, including to give Truman the first Medicare card after that legislation was passed. And even Richard Nixon, who Truman absolutely loathed, when he became president in 1969, the Truman said, yes, come and visit. It was kind of a frosty visit, but he came as well. Everybody eventually sort of made that pilgrimage to independence for the Truman Library. Truman did some travel of his own, 3 trips to Europe in his retirement years. Maybe one of note was when he went to Great Britain. He went to visit Chartwell and the Churchills. He had lunch with the Queen at Buckingham Palace, and he got an honorary degree from Oxford, which he was very particularly proud of. What about politics? He certainly was very politically aware, continued to read newspapers, write a lot of letters, talk to folks, but he tried to stay out of the limelight. He did get into a little bit of a thing in 1960 when Kennedy was running, and Truman frankly thought he was too young. He wasn't ready. He was pitching Stuart Symington for the Democratic nomination, but once Kennedy got the nomination, he completely got on board. He was happy that he won, and Kennedy honored Truman with a reception and a night, a big celebration at the White House. The Trumans even spent one night at the White House, which he very much appreciated. He was certainly distraught when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Truman was going to a lot of funerals, and he of course went to Kennedy's funeral, and there was a moment there after the service where the Eisenhowers invited the Trumans to join them in their limousine as they headed back to Blair House. And in fact, when they got there, the Eisenhowers stayed and had a bite to eat for about an hour or so. And there was all this buzz of reporters, a great rapprochement between Truman and Eisenhower, which was really kind of overblown. It was just a moment in time, as Margaret Truman basically said, this was just civil people being hospitable to each other. Truman started to slow down in 1964. He had a fall in his bathroom. He broke a couple of ribs. He actually was unconscious briefly, and he started to fade, really stopped going to the library in about 1967. Did celebrate his 50th wedding anniversary with Bess very quietly in the house in 1969. And then in 1972, on December the 5th, he had lung congestion. He was taken by ambulance to the hospital where he never left. He went into a coma on Christmas Day, and he died the next day, December 26th of 1972, 7:50 in the morning. He was 88 years old. Bess Truman lived another 10 years. She didn't die until 1982. She died at the age of 97. Both of them were buried in the lovely courtyard at the Truman Library. Truman was a student of history, and he was aware that snap judgments by contemporaries weren't necessarily to be trusted. When he left office, his favorability rating was 32%, obviously not very good, and the war in Korea had a lot to do with it. But time and perspective has certainly changed the view, at least of historians, of Harry Truman. We've talked in these episodes about a laundry list of consequential decisions, difficult decisions that he made in his time. In particular, obviously, the decision to drop the atomic bomb, which he believed and contended forever. It actually saved lives. It was horrific, but it saved lives. But really standing up to the Soviets. There would be no appeasement on Harry Truman's watch. He stood up to them in Berlin. He stood up to them in Korea. And he did it all without creating World War III in the time of atomic weapons coming of age. These were some major, major accomplishments. In terms of all those decisions, Harry Truman had no regrets. He told Merle, I have none. Considering the information available at the time and the circumstances prevailing when I had to make many of my decisions, I do not see how I could have acted very differently. Historians have taken notice as well. Presidential rankings. There have been about 18 major presidential rankings from 9 organizations since 1996. Harry Truman is in the top 10 in every one of them, mostly rated about 6 or 7. There's only one person who started out as a vice president, elevated to the presidency at the death of the president. That ranks higher, and that's Theodore Roosevelt. Truman didn't seek the vice presidency, but when he took it, He got the job, and when Franklin Roosevelt died, he embraced the responsibilities of being president of the United States. He made one difficult decision after another in a tremendous time of national peril with, again, the Cold War very much underway. Nobody really knew how that was going to turn out, and he eventually, again, checked the Soviets when he needed to. There was no World War III. He was proud of his accomplishments, and history has looked kindly on the man who was a country farmer from Missouri who became the President of the United States. That's Harry Truman, from Mr. President to Mr. Citizen, from the life of Harry Truman. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.